If you've ever been around the history or alternate history side of YouTube, you've probably heard of Whatifalthist at some point. In recent years, he's gained a bit of a reputation for being an interesting character, to put it mildly. Now, tons of people have made videos responding to him already, and I'm not here to dunk his very latest video or comment on his antics elsewhere. What I want to do is to respond to his take on the Industrial Revolution. I'll be responding to Explaining the Industrial Revolution, a video he uploaded to his second channel in September last year. I know that this isn't the most relevant video out there by any means, but I want to respond to it for a few reasons. The first is that in this video, he says some interesting things, but also a lot of really strange things that are wrong for weird, complicated reasons. A second reason is that I am a history student who has studied this topic, and I have some level of familiarity with this specific period that other response videos mostly tend to pass over. The third reason is that, for all the weird and downright crazy things he thinks about history and society and politics, I do think he deserves a serious response, because he sees himself as a serious historian. Others might not see it that way, and I don't, for reasons I'll get to later. But for now at least, I want to try to judge him by the same standard you would any other historian. And finally, the fourth reason is that I think the way he approaches this topic is illustrative of how he deals with other historical problems in his other videos, and most of the criticisms I make here apply to those other issues and topics as well. To make things less confusing, I'll mostly be responding to this one video. He has talked about the Industrial Revolution in passing numerous times, but I think it would just be unnecessarily confusing if I constantly jump back and forth between different videos. He talks about a lot of things in this video, so I'll mainly cover what I think are the most important parts. In any case, I'll provide timestamps if you want to go back to the source and get more context. I will actually not start at the beginning, since around 5 minutes into the video, he says something interesting.
I am going to do something I haven't seen done before in combining both the positives of the Industrial Revolution with the negatives that the Unabomber talks about.
Alright. Off to a good start. If you ignore the roaring 1,000-pound gorilla in the room, the Unabomber name drop, this is quite the standard he set for himself. We'll just have to wait and see if he lives up to his promise. Now, rolling back to the start of the video, after introducing himself and his host and the topic of the video, he says the following.
The Industrial Revolution, it's possibly the most important event in history, because it completely changed the calculus in a way that's difficult for people to understand, where there's a handful of authors who made what I think were reasonable calculations, like Malthus or Karl Marx or Carlyle. These are all thinkers from the early 19th century who wrote books that made sense, and then the Industrial Revolution just steamrolled them.
This is a pretty reasonable description, I think, but I have to make a small comment. I think he underestimates how gradual the whole process was. I mean, to put some numbers on it, one estimate puts the annual growth of income per person in Britain from 1800 to 1830 at a measly 0.52%. I mean, it took a very long time for the beneficial effects of industrialization to fully take shape. So, at least at a surface level, people like Malthus seem to have a point, since, living standards didn't seem to improve from one year to the next. But as it points out, they got things wrong in the long run. Anyway, he then moves on to describe technological change.
And so this speed of change, it's as if the wizards of the West kept on discovering more and more powerful magic every generation, and the world became this game of guessing what new kind of magic people would develop.
Putting aside the magic thing, this is also not a bad description. As for the causes, he emphasizes two different ones, which are culture and institutions. In his eyes, 18th century Britain happened to have the perfect cultural and political environment for experiencing an industrial revolution.
Industrialization is at its foremost a cultural technology, in that certain societies have cultures that allow them to industrialize, because industrialization, it's how well you can work with a systematized system.
And a minute or so later, he continues.
So what this signifies is that the Industrial Revolution requires a tremendous amount of standardization across people, across broad systems.
And for the kinds of institutions that were needed.
In 18th century Britain, a confluence of variables came together that allowed the Industrial Revolution. Britain was the first truly pluralist political system to develop, in that Britain didn't practice slavery, it had an open labor market, it had a parliamentary democracy that was responsive to the public, there was a patent system, and the merchant classes were in charge.
And he continues by explaining why these factors were beneficial in that they gave, private individuals and firms, an incentive to engage in productive activities without fear of being expropriated. And so, the first societies that industrialized after Britain were, the ones most similar to Britain, France, Germany, the United States, and eventually most of Western Europe eventually also industrialized, due to their cultural and political similarities. He also discusses the societal effects of industrialization at some length.
The first generation of the Industrial Revolution was absolutely brutal. And you look at Karl Marx, who writes a lot about this, where Karl Marx was reacting to the horrifying conditions of the first generation of industrialization, where part of the reason the Industrial Revolution happened was that Europe was experiencing acute overpopulation, which meant that people were incredibly poor, and Marx blamed this on capitalism, but it was really a global trend. The thing, though, is that Europe broke out of it through the Industrial Revolution.
There's still a good half hour left of the video where he talks about other issues, but I think this is a good place to cut off the chronological coverage. I now want to delve into what he's missing. It's perfectly legitimate to talk about culture as the cause of the Industrial Revolution. Personally, I also subscribe to a cultural explanation for it. But you have to keep a massive asterisk next to that word in your head, because it is people who act, and not, quote-unquote, cultures. Entire societies and cultures as a whole are not geared towards some one single end, like efficiency and organization, like he asserts. And on the other hand, you don't need to have some complex, in-depth theory of human action to explain all economic activity. All you need to know is that individuals or organizations act based on reasons they personally think are good enough, or at the least better than the alternative. To make some examples, there have been enterprising individuals and groups all throughout pre-modern Europe. For example, look at the Jews in Eastern Europe. One of the reasons why some groups of Jews did as well as they did was because laws, some places, made it so that the majority Christian population could not partake in certain economically important activities like banking. Being minorities, they were obviously being discriminated against, but they made the best that they could of their situation. And similarly, in Western Europe, groups like the French Protestant Huguenots brought important technical skills with them to other countries when they were forcibly expelled from France in the 17th century. They did this in spite of a generally unfavorable environment. Claims that the ability to rationally organize things is a prerequisite, but I honestly fail to see why. As he says, industrialization is at its core a cultural technology, but you could easily argue that the causality runs the other way. The factory system and the standardization that came with it, that he makes so much of, it didn't exist before the Industrial Revolution. It was something that emerged slowly over time as small proto-industrial businesses in towns in the countryside combined into larger and larger units, eventually becoming factories. If bureaucratic control and organization really was a prerequisite, as he argues, a highly coercive state like Russia would have industrialized first, not Britain. I would also argue that science is the product of a cultural environment, and I find it really disappointing that he failed to mention how science linked up with the Industrial Revolution. He doesn't address this in this video, but it's something he's made a huge point about in his earlier videos. The evidence overall for science's direct role is mixed, but there are reasons for thinking that certain technologies wouldn't have progressed the way they did if it weren't for earlier scientific discoveries. The steam engine is an obvious example. It was a product of collaboration between scientists and engineers based in Italy, France, and Britain. It was an international project. For emphasizing the role of state institutions as much as he does, he fails miserably at describing what the state actually did. His description of 18th century Britain is only halfly accurate. It's true that it was a representative parliamentary state and that property rights were respected, but to call it democratic is an exaggeration. Elections were notoriously corrupt in much of the country, with some counties being labeled rotten boroughs because pretty much no voters actually lived there, and they had a disproportionate share of representation in the parliament in London. The franchise was restricted to something below 10% of the population. Public opinion and civil society organizations certainly mattered, and that was one way the general populace could influence policies, but he doesn't mention this. There is an ongoing debate over what exactly the role of the state is in fostering development, and many authors have extended the discussion to the 18th century. The evidence is unclear. I would caution against drawing conclusions too quickly, mostly because it's not really clear what the effects of the British state's policies were, or how great its reach even was. Some historians would argue the exact opposite of what Whatifalthist does. Historians like Patrick O'Brien and Emmanuel Wallerstein have argued in the past that Britain succeeded because it had a highly regulated economy with high tariffs, high taxes, a highly coercive state apparatus, and a large overseas empire. I don't buy into this view at all. I think there are major holes in the interventionist theory for industrialization. But the fact that Whatifalthist is seemingly oblivious to this whole debate about the role of the state, or that it could even have played any role at all, makes him seem more ignorant than anything. In principle, I agree with him about the importance of things like property rights and economic freedom, but there's no nuance to his discussion. At one point, he said that Britain was ruled by the merchant classes. Now, keep in mind what time period this is. This is the 18th century. What do you think some of those merchants would have been trading and shipping across the Atlantic Ocean? You can't really ignore the elephant in the room of slavery. Again, there's a huge debate about the role of slavery during the Industrial Revolution, and I won't go into it here, but I'm bringing it up because it's one of the big external factors that some authors use to explain industrialization. From Whatifalthist's explanation of how the Industrial Revolution began in Britain, you would have no idea that there existed any populated land masses beyond the cliffs of Dover. He doesn't mention trade with the Americas or Asia at all. He doesn't mention the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which the Dutch had a major role in bringing about. And he doesn't even mention the Enlightenment and the inflow of new ideas from the rest of Europe. Some Marxist historians have emphasized the role of capital accumulation from outside Europe, and argue that this was where much of the impetus for industrialization came from. A much more moderate version of the overseas influence argument, like the one Whatifalthist unintentionally presents, simply argues that merchants were a powerful group in British politics, not the dominant one, and they therefore had to negotiate with other groups to further their interests. But if you want to make that argument, you kind of have to take a much broader perspective than what he does in this video. Frankly, he goes off the rails when he describes the social effects of industrialization. One argument he makes is what he calls over-socialization, and I let him speak for a while again to let him make his point.
And humans are by nature crazy monkeys, and people don't like the standardization. And what the Unabomber said is that this came at the cost of the human soul. And this is how humans evolved. Humans evolved to have intact communities, families, religion. And these are the things from studies over the last 30 years we've consistently found make people the happiest. And so what industrial civilization does is it turns humans into cogs, and it gives them incredible wealth in exchange for this. But then the term the Unabomber invented is called over-socialization. Over-socialization is the destruction of what makes us human to fit into the machine better.
To his credit, he does acknowledge that he was a bit of a crazy person who killed a lot of innocent people and got a lot of things wrong. More importantly, he thinks that the ultimate goal of returning to pre-industrial life was insane.
Also, I think he also over-glorified the return to monkey, and I think his return to monkey scenario is completely ridiculous because once you've opened Pandora's box with the Industrial Revolution, you can't go back.
Putting aside the fact that Kaczynski was a bit of a schizoid, does his argument hold up? So, his point is that through the process of standardization and conformity, industrialization turns people into obedient machines. But, I don't know, even at face value, I don't think it holds much water. I think the problem is that he fundamentally mischaracterizes pre-modern societies. You see this kind of idyllic, romantic picture of what pre-modern life was like in both right-wing and left-wing circles, where they both glorify the life of the rural peasant before the arrival of the welfare state or big business or whatever. You have to keep in mind that in a quote-unquote traditional society, where you knew and lived with one group of people in one village your entire life, they had a tremendous amount of power over you. The kind of indirect and informal coercion that can emerge in small communities like that can be just as stifling and oppressive to individual well-being and initiative as the modern state apparatus. I mean, there's nothing magical about small-scale communities that make them more, quote-unquote wholesome than urban industrial societies. I think this misapprehension comes from our ignorance of what pre-modern life was actually like, and people like Whatifalthist and Ted Kaczynski are just projecting their own views and expectations on the past. Also, Kaczynski's critique really is nothing new. The deeply conservative writer Thomas Carlyle derided the market economy as a cash nexus, where nothing more than cold, calculating material interest held people together. And much later, the socialist Hungarian journalist Karl Polanyi wrote his famous embeddedness critique, where he argued that a social disaster had happened as a result of economic freedom and industrialization, and that the only way to solve it was to regulate the economy and put it back under society's control. This is not even to mention the long tradition of Marxist historians like E.P. Thompson, who've basically dedicated their entire careers to documenting the lives of working and lower-class people. I mean, Whatifalthist just seems to be completely ignorant of the often very popular critics of industrialization who've been active in the last 200 or so years. I bring up these older authors, on both the left and the right, because it completely debunks his notion that this vague and poorly defined category of leftists, whoever they are, want to completely tear society apart.
What the Unabomber said is that leftism is a derivation of resentment against over-socialization, where the left is obsessed with power. And leftist societies only really took over in industrialized societies. And look at leftism. Leftism is a power fantasy where mankind is a god capable of changing everything. We control reality. And the left always leads to having a dictator with complete power. And the left never changes their strategy because leftists secretly want to be the dictator subconsciously. So they establish a system where a dictatorship has total power, and they don't change it because the purpose is the power fantasy. And you look at the left. The left wants to destroy the family, the religion, community, ethnic ties. They want to destroy the traditional culture, history, identity. The left wants to rip apart every single piece of society. So the only thing that's left is power and the machine.
I don't identify as a leftist in any way, but this is just terrible. What he's doing here is he is conflating the ends and means of a highly diverse political group that has existed for a very long time, which is really more like an unholy temporary alliance than an actual real group of people that are united around just one single idea. The actual diversity of what people believe is completely masked by a label like this. There absolutely are left-wing forms of totalitarianism, but individual people identify as left-wing for reasons they personally find convincing. There's not some soul root psychological cause that makes people believe one thing or another. I mean, they have their own rationales that they keep to themselves, and Whatifalthist does not have privileged administrator access to their mental states. It can't paint all leftists with a broad brush like this. Even terms like left-wing and right-wing, they're just shorthands we use to make discourse simpler. They're not objective categories that exist independently of what people think of them. Really, I think this is just terrible, bad armchair psychology. Frankly, this is some of the most extreme bad faith reasoning I've ever seen. Towards the end of the video, he draws a timeline into the 21st century, and he's already described both the really good things and really terrible things industrialization can do to society. But I think it's worth dwelling on the point about totalitarianism a little longer. He states that
I really haven't gotten into the totalitarianism that came out of the Industrial Revolution, but that's we've covered that in other videos, where the Industrial Revolution let the state have incredible power, which led to Hitler and Stalin and people just massively abusing the power.
The point about state power is debatable. Personally, I would argue that totalitarian governments can and do exist independently of what you might call the objective, for lack of a better word, economic capacity of a society. Just look at Chinese society. The very first Chinese emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi, who seized power in 221 BC, implemented a horrifically oppressive state and tried to control every aspect of his citizens' lives. And the whole legalist tradition of political thought in China is arguably one of the first coherent totalitarian doctrines in history, and it existed millennia before fascism and communism came into being in industrializing Europe. Of course, more advanced technology and industry do make totalitarian rule easier. I can't remember who said it exactly, but there's a saying that it's far easier to run a totalitarian dictatorship using trains than with a horse and buggy. But honestly, if you ask me, my hunch is that the kinds of institutions and political cultures a particular society goes into the process of industrialization with matters a lot more. And contingency matters. You can't predict in advance how the institutions of a given state are going to change as a result of industrialization. I mean, it wasn't inevitable that the Nazis or Bolsheviks came to power, and had things gone differently, their power grabs could very easily have been thwarted. I'm not quite done yet, because personally, I would argue that one of the most important things a historian can do when presenting a causal explanation of an event is to place it in a comparative framework. Basically, you have to compare countries with each other. Originally, I planned on doing or comparing Europe with all the other major regions in Eurasia, but it became way too repetitive and unfocused, so for the sake of brevity, I've narrowed it down just to two places, mainland Europe and China. So in medieval and early modern Europe, there existed a commercial nation with a parliamentary legislature, rule of law, a large overseas empire, an elaborate patent system, and a political system ruled by the merchant classes. I'm of course talking about Venice. So, so what went wrong? Why didn't Venice or the rest of northern Italy industrialize way before Britain? In spite of seemingly having all the same prerequisites. I mean, it could be loads of things. It could be that they didn't have science. It could be that they were harmed by constant wars. It could be that the political system was too corrupt and funneled talent in the wrong direction. I mean, we just don't know. In general, he fails to connect developments in Britain with those in the rest of Europe. In countless of his earlier videos, he has talked at length about how the culture and politics of Europe as a continent made it a uniquely dynamic place as early as the 11th century, with constant innovations in military organization, political institutions, technological discoveries. But now that he actually has the opportunity to talk about how the Industrial Revolution was affected by, historical processes that took centuries or even a millennium to unfold, he completely fails to do it. This is one of the biggest lost opportunities I've ever seen. I mean, if anything, the causal factors he emphasizes makes the Industrial Revolution seem like an extremely contingent event with shallow historical roots that could very easily have been prevented. So, what was the rest of Europe like at the start of Britain's industrialization process? The picture is mixed. Generally speaking, the western half of the continent was richer than the rest, but there were islands of prosperity amid poorer regions. France was very close behind Britain. France actually experienced faster growth in its international trade than Britain did. And for foreign observers in the 18th century, the Dutch Republic was a byword for prosperity. As Adam Smith put it, the Netherlands was one of the places in Europe nearest to attaining its full complement of riches. If you take a Europe-wide perspective, a new question emerges. Why didn't the Low Countries industrialize first instead of Britain? Or for that matter, why did the earlier commercial centers like Flanders or Italy seemingly lose steam before making a breakthrough? And why didn't Britain's growth peter out? In his video, Whatifalthist does briefly mention China, specifically the Song Dynasty period.
The Industrial Revolution in our timeline started in 18th century England, and it nearly started in China 1,000 years ago, because in China, in the Song Dynasty, they had these enormous blast furnaces that created an enormous amount of iron on a scale that was not equivalent to anything that existed before in history or would until 19th century Britain. The issue for both the Greeks and the Chinese is that their social structure didn't create incentives for the Industrial Revolution. I say that industrialization is a cultural phenomena for this reason, where in China what happened is that the bureaucracy that ran China created regulations and taxes that were so bad that it created zero incentive to actually build a factory because you wouldn't drive enough benefit.
It's true that China did experience a prolonged period of economic growth during the Song Dynasty period, but a great deal of research from the last few decades indicates that for all of its history, China has had a dynamic market economy. I think he's mostly unaware of this research. In an earlier video, Whatifalthist asserted that China was more or less stuck in a civilizational rut for most of the second millennium, and it was completely unable to break out of the limitations put on it by a combination of Confucian philosophy and autocratic government. But this newer, more positive school of historians makes a slightly different interpretation, because if you look at two things that really mattered to rulers of pre-modern empires, like land and population size, 18th century China was a huge success. I mean, just look at the map. And the population growth is nothing to sneeze at either. Personally, I think the revisionist literature goes a little too far with asserting how inventive and well-off pre-industrial China was. Whatifalthist says that Song Dynasty's steel output was equivalent to that of 19th century Britain, but That was an estimate calculated by one historian back in the 60s, and a more recent calculation places it at around a tenth of that. And unlike in Europe, Chinese merchants had no real political representation anywhere, and they were seen as social parasites by the Confucian bureaucratic elite. And if you want to talk about areas where 18th century China failed terribly, I would point to three areas that mattered a lot, which were diversity of thought, technological progress, and market integration. The presence of intellectual diversity, technological dynamism, and an ever-growing market integration in Europe, on the other hand, made a huge difference over there. But overall, the picture of a poor, decadent, backwards Ming and Qing era China is not really tenable, and this is extremely ironic, considering that Whatifalthist has a long series on his main channel about the histories of the different civilizations of the world, or he tries to understand them in their own terms. I mean, in his video about Chinese civilization, he outright describes China as fundamentally decadent from roughly 1200 or so to 1900, completely ignoring the changes that did take place between then, like they weren't important at all. And the post-Song Dynasty China really had industrialized like 18th century Britain did. That would make most of his earlier videos about the early cultural and military dynamism of Western civilization basically obsolete, since some other factor besides culture would have intervened earlier on in history to make industrialization possible. Culture wouldn't have been irrelevant, of course, but it would have interacted with some other factor to let the industrialization happen. But what's the problem? I mean, we only have so much time in the day to read about certain things. It's literally impossible to know everything about everything, of course. There's a reason why historians themselves specialize in certain fields and try to get real good at least one thing. I think it's unreasonable to crap on YouTubers for merely getting a couple facts wrong. Everyone does that from time to time. And it's also unreasonable to criticize people for not making videos the same way you would have done it. That's not really constructive criticism in any way. But towards the end of the video, he has an exchange with his co-host that I find extremely revealing.
Do you have any questions?
I mean, that was a great overview. I mean, part of it, I was asked, like, where do you think the traditional narrative of the Industrial Revolution sort of differs from your perception of it,
So
separate from what you've said, right?
the traditional narrative is, woohoo, this is heaven on earth. We're so much better than our ancestors. And I like to say any given traditional narrative on any topic is half true and it misses the other half. And so it is true that the Industrial Revolution created this quantum breakthrough in human development, but we're completely ignoring the negatives.
I don't know how else to put it but this is just blatantly wrong. I immensely dislike his use of both the collective we and the quote-unquote traditional narrative here. I mean, who is this we? Who is he referring to? I mean, the general population, or is it other historians? And when he talks about, the traditional narrative, I mean, what he's doing here is that he's insinuating that there exists this orthodoxy that all historians are indoctrinated into. I mean, if you're talking about, misconceptions about the Industrial Revolution, among the population at large, that's understandable. But you don't get to say that if you're talking about specific historians who study it. If you ask 10 different specialists on the Industrial Revolution 20 different questions, they're not going to give you a predictable set of answers, based on their own research and perspectives. They're inevitably going to arrive at different conclusions. This video has been a response to just this one video, but honestly, he could have made a similar response to any of his other videos. I think the way he engages with and talks about historical topics and other historians in general is deeply problematic. To make his arguments, he presents a simplistic, overly streamlined narrative based on his own highly selective reading of that topic, and claims to unearth some deep, hidden revelations that no one's ever heard of before. And arguably, even then, the facts he does present don't even fit together neatly. Like, he doesn't ever consider any alternative solutions or perspectives. He just looks for quick and dirty answers that he personally deems good enough, and settles for the first thing he sees. I mean, to put it as bluntly as I possibly can, his videos are lazy pseudo-scholarship. For these reasons, I think he has zero credibility as a historian, and he should not be taken seriously. But I am also a firm believer in learning from a bad example. I recommend watching him, not to learn from him, but to treat him as an abject lesson in bad history. Of course, I need to put the disclaimer out there, because I don't want to be misinterpreted. I don't think his channels should be taken down, and he shouldn't be deplatformed. It's really a little disconcerting that he has an audience as large as the one he has, but I think the only way to properly fight, disinformation about history like this is to put better ideas out there. And if I may be allowed to do a little bit of special pleading for my own field, the Industrial Revolution is a perfect example of how there's so much more to history than memorizing these long lists of boring facts like you do in high school. It's not about, paying by the numbers. It's not about memorizing the correct answers. It's about throwing crazy ideas at the wall and seeing what sticks. Every day we make new discoveries, and there will always be more, questions to try to answer. And one last thing. Because he ended his video with a short round of book recommendations, I'll do the same for anyone who's interested in looking into the topic. As a general survey of Britain's Industrial Revolution, I think Joel Mokyer's The Enlightened Economy is unsurpassed. It's very thorough and fun to read. For a work that views the Industrial Revolution as like an international, long-term historical process, I strongly recommend Eric Jones's The European Miracle. Next, I think Daron Acemoglu and James A. Robinson's The Narrow Corridor is a good introduction to the politics of Britain's Industrial Revolution, placed in a broader European perspective with tons of other historical comparisons. And finally, I disagree with it on a lot of points, but I would recommend J. Bradford DeLong's Slouching Towards Utopia, since it'll give you a different sort of perspective, angle on industrialization that's worth thinking out. But overall, instead of watching Whatifalthist, you should, I don't know, go out and touch some grass maybe. Maybe play a video game. Anything else will be better.